The merchant lady once complained loudly that Brando had tricked her into joining this pirate ship. But Brando told this little cutie that if she wanted to become a great merchant, it was impossible for her not to get used to the wind and waves of the sea. In the end, she could only bury her head in her pillow and groan a few times. I think I'm starting to understand my father a little, my lord. Amandina stood at the side of the ship, looking down at the white trail left by the ship on the blue sea. In fact, she was also not feeling well, but when she thought that her lord was still on the deck as an aide she could not leave alone, so she gritted her teeth and endured. Brando turned to look at his quiet aide. Amandina was like all the noble ladies of Erewhon who were born into a noble family. She was full of a kind of intellectual demeanor, but she was different from all of them in her strength. Before I came out with my lord, I did not know that the outside world was so vast and beautiful, and it was so moving. Although I have seen the scenery described in my father's notes, I only understood today that if you were not there yourself, you would not be able to imagine how tempting it is to explore it. Just like now, when I stand here and look at the intersection of the sky and the sea in the distance, I can't help but think about what is on the other side of the sea. Amandina could not help but press down on her hair that was blown away by the sea breeze. This action gave her a weak and youthful charm. I think my father also thinks so. Brando heard that Amandina's tone was a little faint, and he knew that she was thinking about her parents who had passed away and her hometown in Grimoires. For a moment he was a little dazed. Yes, he was also drifting. He had his own family in this world, but they did not belong to Sophie's half. He was not prepared to return to that place, and he did not know how to face it at the moment. Amandina's self-pity was because she was homeless, but he had a home that he could not go back to. Thinking of this, Brando could not help but ask, "Do you blame him?" Amandina shook her head. "I don't know, my mother would occasionally complain, but I feel that I should understand him because I was born into a noble family, and I should be more sensible than other children. But it was one thing to think about it, but later on, I found that I still resented him in my heart." She sighed faintly. No matter how beautiful the scenery in this world is, it can't compare to his wife and daughter. How I envy the children in the neighborhood, even though their family background is far inferior to mine. Brando looked at the girl's side profile and asked, "Does your father know about your talent in creating the magic transmission core?" "I think he knows. Although he rarely comes home, he often brings me some incomplete documents. I feel that he still cares about his daughter, but maybe the direction is not quite right." Brando touched the grayish-brown stone in his bag. Ever since he saw the magic quartz sand in the underground hall, he felt that this thing might be related. "Think you're right. He cares about you, but everyone has a different way of expressing their feelings," Brendel said softly. Amandina raised her head slightly, her dark eyes looking at Brando with some doubt. At this time, Carglass came up with a young officer of the White Lion Guard. Although this young man had never been on a ship before, he seemed to have an innate talent to accept new things in the shortest amount of time. In just half a day, he could walk on the deck as well as the most experienced sailor. Even Captain James was surprised and praised him for being a natural sailor. Of course, James was also surprised by Brando's knowledge. Brando was too embarrassed to say that he had a few years of experience in the sea. How old was he? His experience was too much, and he could only lie and say that he had seen some of the mage's documents. Knowledge from books was completely different from actual experience, and this did not escape the young captain's eyes. But a mage's item was always a box for a normal person, and anything could be stuffed into it. Furthermore, Brendel's mage servant was obviously a Highland wizard, so his suspicions were barely dispelled. As for the young officer beside Carglass, his expression was not good. Even after the battle at the Gree River, Brando had never seen such a depressed expression on the young officers' faces. These brave young men could defeat even the most terrifying enemies, but in the face of nature, they had to retreat. "The quality of your men is really good. I've seen many soldiers in Ampere Seal and Karsuk, but I've never seen such outstanding young men." At this time, the captain suddenly turned around and pointed at Carglass and the young officer beside him with a pipe in his hand. Indeed, although the young men were trembling in fear, compared to ordinary people who went to sea for the first time, they were already outstanding. Still far from it. Brando shook his head. This time he brought the most people with him to Ampere Seal, the future White Lion infantry. All 40 young men made up almost 2/3 of the entourage. Brando had high hopes for these young men. He hoped that they could go through some hardships with him in the future. In the end, everyone who stayed behind could become the backbone of the future Erewhon. Of course, these young men might not understand this yet, but no one doubted that it was a bad thing for their lord to bring them along. Young men were the age where they were full of passion and drive. No matter how strong the enemy was, they would still dare to challenge it. This was the story of a newborn calf who was not afraid of a tiger. But thanks to the captain, I brought a lot of people this time. In addition to the camouflaged goods and the necessary food and water, the captain's cargo was much smaller. Brando quickly added. This time he brought a lot of people with him. Because Ampere Seal involved business matters, the Roman had to come along. Brando did not trust her to go alone, so he brought along Amandina. Moreover, Amandina was the person who was most familiar with Erewhon nobles. She was also smart, and her presence would be of great help to his goal. Next was the mercenaries of Lopez. This was a prophecy. Brando had joked that he would bring Amandina, Falerne, and the rest to Ampere Seal to broaden their horizons. Now that there was an opportunity, he would not be the first to break his promise. Moreover, the mercenaries of Lopez were experienced and there was no possibility of casualties. They could guide the young men of the White Lion infantry during the operation. Next was the Shire. The Shire was his mage attendant, and he had to go as a cover for his identity as a Highland knight. The rest were Ropar, Mephistopheles, Andrique, and Medisha. This trip to Ampere Seal to destroy the marriage alliance was full of danger to Brando. Although he was in the dark and the enemy was in the light, Brando knew that there must be other people who did not want the marriage alliance to succeed. The royal faction and the Grand Duke would definitely take precautions, so in terms of combat power, Brando would not mind having too many. Finally, there was Scarlet. This girl was almost like Brando's shadow. She rarely spoke, but she never left Brando's side. Although the aftereffects of the blood of God were almost impossible to recur after absorbing the golden apple and the dragon's blood, she still could not leave Brando's side for the time being. Brando had said before that he would let her go after her injuries were healed, but seeing her in this state, he could only keep his mouth shut. At the same time, there was an unexpected guest. Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles did not inform anyone about Brando's plan. According to him, it was to ensure that his contractor and half of his students would not die in Ampere Seal. However, even if Grey Sword said that he was going for a sightseeing tour, Brando believed that no one would dare to object. After all, Grey Sword's strength was obvious. On the other hand, the old swordsman Coden was not willing to take the initiative to participate in his affairs because of Count Ranner. Otherwise, there would be another strong person in the Gold faction, and it was just these people that filled up the entire ship. And this was the result of Brendel keeping the Fireclaw Spearmen, Wind Spirit Spiders, Fire Djinn, and Holy Angel cards that were more conspicuous. One had to know that a normal merchant ship would only have the necessary sailors, and it was impossible for it to be filled with soldiers like a warship. According to legend, the Nagas were the descendants of the sky serpent. They were all half-human, half-snake monsters. The Naga males had one less pair of arms than the females. This was because the Naga gods wanted the females to be more agile than the males. The males only needed to be on the battlefield, so they needed to be more powerful. However, these were all myths and legends. In reality, the Nagas and mermaids were good at throwing spears. The male Nagas had 2 pairs of arms. One pair of arms held the trident that they were good at, while the other pair was good at using short swords and shields. The mineral resources under the sea were rich. They did not have to worry about iron and copper, which were commonly used to make weapons and armor. The Nagas knew how to use underwater volcanoes to smelt and forge weapons. They also had special methods to protect their weapons underwater. Therefore, they were not inferior to the humans on land in terms of weapons. However, the biggest difference between the weapons and armor of the Nagas and humans was the shuttle-shaped shields. This was a specialty of the Nagas. It was used to reduce resistance underwater. Seeing that the mermaid's seductive voice did not work, the Nagas floated up to the surface and used their most common tactic. They threw spears at the deck of the faraway like rain. Unfortunately, Captain James was experienced and had already ordered his men to erect shields. The shields used on ships were actually double-layered tower shields that were commonly seen on Wone's battlefields. They were usually hung upside down on the sides of the ship, and when needed, they could be pulled up with ropes. The steel spears hit the thick shields like raindrops, but to no avail. The shields on the ship were specially designed to deal with these common robbers. The Faraway was a large ship, so it was even more well-prepared. The Naga spears were either embedded in the shields or fell powerlessly into the water. After a while, Grey-Sword St. Mephistopheles, the Shire Andrique, Scarlet Mephistopheles Ropar, and the Silver Fairy Princess also came to the deck. Seeing these people, James finally let out a sigh of relief. Although he did not know the full strength of this young lord beside him, he knew that at least Medisha and the Shire had the strength of a gold tier. With 2 gold tiers in charge, even the flagship of Erewhon's fleet could not compare. "What's going on?" Mephisto asked calmly as he walked out of the cabin and saw the monsters on the surface of the sea. Captain James did not know that this ordinary-looking middle-aged man was Brando's biggest boss on this trip. However, just this calmness alone was enough to make him take a second look. The Ash Sword Saint's calmness was not without reason. After all, this was the beginning of the Year of Swords. It was not like the end of the Slate War where the bandits on the road could be elemental awakened. At this time, not to mention Erewhon, even when Mephisto's duchy was still under cruise, he was still one of the top fighters in the Empire. For a fighter of his level, as long as he was careful, it would be difficult to find any existence in the entire Wone that could kill him. And a few Nagas were not a problem at all. "It's the Nagas," Brando replied. He held his sword and did not immediately attack. He looked at the Naga warriors on the surface of the sea, and felt that they were somewhat familiar. Although the Nagas looked similar to humans, there were still differences between different tribes. For example, the Shining Scale tribe was named for their colorful scales. The tribe Brando looked a bit like the gray fin Naga. When he saw the pale scales, he could not help but be slightly startled. Could it be that coincidental? These are the Nagas? The Ash Sword Saint had heard of the Nagas before. But he was born in the interior of the Empire, and had been fighting against the Empire all his life. He had never taken a ship out to sea, so he had only heard of the Nagas but never seen them. He looked at the monsters and could not help but be slightly startled. He turned back and said, "Why do you always run into trouble wherever you go?" Brando did not expect this serious guy to ridicule him in such a serious manner. But only he would have the leisure to do so at a time like this. But he did not expect Orthless to nod in agreement. "I think this guy is right. You always run into trouble wherever you go." Mother Marcia above. "I'm innocent too." Brendel was speechless. When he was in the Amber Sword, he could not obtain any storyline quests, but after transmigrating to this world, he had to be careful at every step. Inexplicable things kept coming to him one after another. But Orthless was just joking. It was very common to run into pirates at sea. Not only were there pirates, but there were also bandits and bandits on land. Most of the feudal lords' management of their territories was limited to the core area. The more remote the area was, the more chaotic it would be. In the outer seas where no one could control, it was a paradise for illegal forces. At this time, the sailors began to fight back. Most of the ships sailing on this route were armed merchant ships, so there was no shortage of weapons on board. The sailors fought back with crossbows, but their attacks were not very accurate. Instead of saying that they wanted to destroy the enemy, it was better to say that they could only force the enemy to retreat. In the midst of the chaos, the sailors under James suffered quite a bit. A few spears pierced through the gaps between the shields and into the crowd, injuring several people. 2 unlucky men were nailed to the deck. The second mate, who was also a doctor on the ship, took a look and said that they could not live. Chapter 529. As the busiest commercial port and cargo distribution center in Erewhon, and even the entire southern part of Cruz, the port was bustling all day long, from the early hours of the morning when the lampposts were hung with cold, shaky lights until the moon rose above the sea. Merchants and dockworkers were busy all day long, accumulating an astonishing amount of wealth for this giant port. Only during the season when storms visited the shining sea every year would this golden sea route be deserted, allowing the residents of the city to stop and rest for a while. Archbishop Wood stood under the white stone lighthouse, wearing a white robe with red trim. A figure like him was sent here by the Holy Cathedral to serve as the bishop of the Ampere-Seal Diocese and the spiritual leader of the Holy Cathedral of Fire in Erewhon. As long as he stayed in this position for 15 years, he would have the qualifications to enter the core power of the Holy Cathedral and become one of the 11 great priests. At that point, even the position of High Priest of the Holy Cathedral of Fire was just a step away. Most people would not be able to imagine what a person of his status would want. Wood's face was thin, and his cheeks were sunken. Even though he was not even 80 years old, he looked like an old man who had been through a lot. Only his sunken eyes were still bright and full of vigor. His majestic aura was enough to make a normal person cower in fear. The archbishop pursed his lips and looked calm, but his heart was not any calmer than the nobles in Aween who had been around for a while. The lion beast men in Toquinen are ready to make a move. They must have the support of the Holy Cathedral of Earth. Wood stood on the hillside and looked at the sailing ships of various sizes coming in and out of the port, leaving long trails in the blue bay. The sailing sails formed a strange sight in the waters of the pier. Every waterway was full of experienced navigators waiting to enter and exit. The wealth contained in the endless stream made the high and mighty man sigh. Erewhon is the front line against the Holy Cathedral of Earth. We cannot allow this civil war to continue for too long. We don't have much time left. Beside him, his good friend, Priest Icon, nodded in agreement. The two of them had been partners for many years. Although neither of them were natives of Erewhon, they knew this ancient kingdom like the back of their hand. However, the lion beast men are getting restless. If they really want to invade, they'll probably have to wait until next year. Especially since they haven't received any rations this autumn, the Earth Holy Hall won't dare to act rashly. Wood glanced at his companion. Do you know how old this white stone lighthouse is, Icon? Priest Icon glanced at the lighthouse beside them. This lighthouse was once the symbol of Ampere-Seal. When the late King Eric built the port here, Ampere-Seal was far from its current size, and it was not a so-called trading port. This lighthouse once guided the navy of the late King Eric and the navy of the Holy Cathedral of Fire to battle on the nearby sea. The Whitestone Lighthouse had always been seen as a symbol of Erewhon, a symbol of persistence in the darkness. It's a pity that the lighthouse was destroyed in a fire 50 years ago. Its historical value was also destroyed. Although a new lighthouse was rebuilt, it's not the same as the original. Icon understood what his companion meant. He admired the royal faction and Her Royal Highness because they had the same persistence for glory as him. However, history was history, and Wood was obviously reminding him to look at all of this fairly. This kingdom is the same. No matter how old it is, the glory it insisted on has been abandoned by its descendants. What's left is just a shell. In comparison, it was given a new mission just like this lighthouse. That's its true value. I understand, Lord Archbishop, Icon replied humbly. Wood nodded. The Holy Cathedral had always been fair, and would not easily interfere in the internal affairs of its subordinate countries. That was why they could maintain their authority. He and his assistant had been partners for many years, and he admired his insistence on justice and honor. But that was then and this was now. He would never allow his assistant to interfere in Aween's internal affairs and side with the princess. Thinking of this, the archbishop could not help but look back at the direction of the city. Ampere-Seal was one of the largest cities in the south. The harbor was connected to the back, and the roofs extended far into the horizon like an ant's nest. The tallest building in the city was undoubtedly the Temple of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The temple was looming in the fog. He could not help but think of what the little girl Magadol had mentioned to him and shook his head. That was impossible. The Holy Cathedral would not side with either side no matter what, and the great priest would not be so hasty. At this time the bell on the white lighthouse rang again. The sound of the bronze bell caused the nearby ground to tremble and the sand to shake. The sound could be heard for dozens of miles, and even half of the city could hear it clearly. The bell indicated that a ship had entered the harbor. Wood and Icon looked up and saw a sailboat with 3 large sails entering the harbor. It's a ship coming back from Lübeck. Icon recognized the flag on the ship immediately. At this time of the year, the storm is about to close off the southern sea route. This should be the last ship coming back from Lübeck this month. It's a little late. People who sail the sea all year round are desperate. Wood looked at the ship and could not help but sigh. People are blinded by money. Although wealth is important, it is not as precious as life. Icon shook his head. But this time the Archbishop did not agree. He only sighed with a famous joke by Hesse I, who was ridiculed as the king of the road in Erewin's history. Without wealth, how can there be life? The 2 high priests sighed on the lighthouse hill, but the officials of the Port Authority of Amperseal were not so idle. To be exact, these small people who were usually busy were almost in a mess. Kinoan O'Paris was the son of a noble family in Amperseal that was neither too big nor too small. Relying on his father's connections, he finally became the deputy director of the Port Authority. However, less than half a week after he took office, a piece of news almost made him throw away the pointed helmet on his head and run away in panic. "What did you say? Pallion, you bastard, what did I tell you yesterday? If you drink too much or joke with me again, I will definitely drive you out. I don't care who you are." The unlucky young man roared angrily at the communication crystal in his hand. He almost threw the valuable thing away. "Do you think I'm an idiot? No, I'm serious." On the other end of the communication crystal was Kinoan's good friend. In Owen's words, they were brothers who grew up together. Even though they were both descendants of nobles, he was not very reliable. He drank too much, played with women while on duty, got into fights and did almost everything that could be done on the docks, but Kinoan kept him here because their relationship could be described with the word iron. But at this moment, the usually sloppy young man seemed to have suffered a great shock. He said in a mournful tone, "Brother, I swear in the name of Lady Martha that I didn't lie to you. I really saw a demon whale. Of course, if the woman who claimed to be a female pirate didn't lie to me, listen to me, that thing is exactly the same as the tattoo on her left, but no, I have to say that the things at sea are much scarier now. F***, but don't mention that woman to me." Kinoan did not even care about the last bit of modesty he had as a noble. Of course, this generation of nobles did not have much modesty to speak of, especially young people who grew up in the mixed environment of Amperseal. He pulled at his collar fiercely, but when he heard that the other party swore in the name of Martha, he felt a little uncertain. He also understood that if possible, this lawless guy would even dare to sleep with Lady Martha. Of course, this was just a saying. Kinoan was now beginning to feel a little helpless. A demon whale was about to attack the port? Oh my God, was he living in a mythical era? Kinoan sat at his expensive mahogany desk and thought for a long time. With great difficulty, he came up with the following 3 comprehensive plans. Abscond with the money, abscond with the money, and abscond with the money. But he immediately crumpled his hair into a ball. If he did that, his old man would be the first to kill him. Kinoan was born to be as lawless as his good brother, and he was not even afraid of the king of Owen. However, he immediately revealed his true colors in front of his old man. When he thought of his old man's angry face, his legs turned to jelly. He grabbed the communication crystal with great difficulty and swallowed his saliva. "Brother, good luck, I'll take my leave first. Wait for me, I'll be right there." Kinoan's words turned into "wait for me. I'll be there right away." The soldiers at the port were in a mess, but at this moment, a certain person on the sea looked at Amperseal from afar and felt very helpless. The port city of Amperseal and the surrounding areas and towns have a population of 310,000. A huge magic system maintains the operation of the city, such as sewage, lighting, water supply, and garbage disposal. The mysterious magic that is rarely seen in the countryside south of Erewin is everywhere here. Merchants spend a lot of money to hire wizards to serve them. Some of these wizards have worked here for decades and are deeply rooted in their positions. The wizards have formed their own guild called the Eye of Amperseal. This wizard organization not only maintains the daily operation of the city, but also intervenes in the security of the port. They prevented venturers from fighting, and set up a city lock to prevent foreign wizards from casting spells in the city. They also set up a super-large anti-air magic circle in the inner city of Amperseal to prevent the port from being attacked from the sky. Brando stood at the side of the ship and introduced the port to the others. Suddenly he sighed. He turned his head with a helpless and almost desperate look in his eyes. Finally, he saw the legendary monster, the king of the sea beasts, the demon whale that was as huge as a mountain, wave its fins at them like a naughty child, and then slowly dived into the deep sea. My old man said that the demon whale's intelligence is not inferior to that of an adult, and now it seems that it is true. Captain James also saw this scene and could not help but sigh. But Amandina looked at Brando suspiciously and could not help but ask, "My lord, what exactly did you give the Nagas? Why did they look at you as if they were looking at their king? They actually let the demon whale escort us into the port. How are we going to hide our identities now?" "But I heard that the Nagas' king is a woman." After a week of training, the little Roman could now freely appear on the deck. She rolled her eyes and directly feminized Brando. Brando wiped the sweat off his forehead. He did not expect the Nagas to be so hospitable, but to let the demon whale escort them into the port, Brando felt that other than the dumb fish Sani, most people would not be able to do something so creative. He coughed and said in disbelief, "Let's see how it goes. Anyway, the people in the port don't know that this big guy is following us. As long as we don't admit it, it'll be fine." With that, he looked at the young captain. James shrugged and replied, "My lord doesn't want to be famous, so I naturally will not overstep my boundaries. My lord, you can rest assured about the people on my ship." At this point, the young captain was actually a little helpless. "To be honest, my lord's reputation is much higher than mine. Even if I don't say anything, they will still keep their mouths shut." What he was talking about was naturally the 2 bottles of holy water that Brando gave him. It could be said that the entire ship's sailors now respected Brando, who had a sword saint as his teacher and was a kind and amiable noble like a god. Oh, to be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 530. When the demon whale disappeared from the surface of the sea, the guards of the port of Amperseal almost set off their cannons in celebration. When Faraway docked, Brando and the rest were not interrogated because Lord Kanoan was busy thinking about how to write about how he fought off the legendary sea monster. Furthermore, there was more than one ship entering and leaving the port. No one would have thought that a demon whale was here to escort Faraway, a 3-masted ship that had just entered the port. Sometimes the truth was closer to a lie, but if anyone dared to tell Kanoan this, the head of the port authority would definitely throw them into the sea to feed the sharks. He did not want his subordinates to treat him like a fool. Faraway docked at Pier 14. As soon as Brando got off the ship, he saw Sue coming to greet him. Sue had arrived in Amperseal under her father's request. This almond-skinned girl with braided hair was now in charge of managing Tanajal's trade with the outside world. She enjoyed a lot of independence. When she was in Brags, she did her job faithfully. Brando trusted her and entrusted her with important tasks. Now, Sue controlled almost all of Tanajal's funds, but when she came to greet them, she was still wearing the same checkered dress as before. When Sue saw Brando, she was a little surprised. Although she knew about the changes in the past year from the letter she exchanged with her father, and knew about Brando's identity and the funds in his hands, she could not help but take a second look at Brando. Brando smiled at her. He was in a good mood to see an old acquaintance of Fortress Reedon. The girl ignored him with a straight face. Of course, she did not forget about her relationship with him. She heard that there were a few more girls around the lord. She was not at ease leaving Freya in the hands of such a playboy. She was only willing to serve Brando because of her father. "Sue." The Roman jumped down from the gangplank and grabbed the girl's hand. His eyes were shining. "Thank you so much for the past few months. Are you okay? I heard from Uncle Reto that you often work late. He's very worried about you." The little Roman was now in charge of Tanajal's business and economy. In a sense, Sue was her direct subordinate. Of course, someone didn't realize it, but Sue couldn't ignore it. The girl glanced at Brando and lowered her head slightly. "Miss Roman, don't be like that. Do you see that the Roman doesn't want to say anything? I can help you pass on the message. Su didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the merchant lady's antics. He finally managed to maintain his solemn expression and asked, "Is father all right?" "He's doing well," Brando finally found the opportunity to interject. "As you know from the letter, everything in the territory is on the right track, and the war has come to an end. Although I don't approve of it, your father has officially become a farmer. He's lost a lot of hair over the reclamation of the Maxin region. He's like a real old farmer, and he's thrown my military training program aside." "He used to farm," Su replied. "Well, then he's going back to his old profession," Brando replied somewhat mischievously. Su thought of her father's appearance and her lips curled up slightly. However, she was dissatisfied with Brando's tone. She glared at him and asked stiffly, "What does my lord want to do next?" "Of course, I want to take a break first," Brando replied. This was the truth. Although he had been through many storms, he felt as if the ground was shaking after a week on the ship. If he was like this, there was no need to talk about the others. The young men of the White Lion Legion were fine on the ship, but when they stepped on solid land, they ran to the side and vomited. The little Roman's body swayed from side to side, but he didn't seem to be aware of it. "I've already arranged a place to stay. It's in the city's Bauhinia Inn. However, my lord brought a lot of people, and it would be too conspicuous for everyone to stay in one inn. That's why I rented the apartment opposite. It's safer and less likely to attract attention. In addition, I've also bought a farmhouse that can be used as shelter if necessary." Su glanced at him and replied. Brando was slightly surprised. He didn't expect this girl to be so capable. She had completed her missions in the past few months in a very orderly manner. Brando liked her for her honesty and reliability, but he didn't expect her to be so quick-witted. Knowing that they might encounter trouble on this trip, she had already arranged a place for them in advance. "Then let's go." Brando suddenly felt that it was too easy to have such a capable subordinate. "Are there any carriages?" Su nodded. Not only were there carriages, but Su had also prepared 10 of them. However, these 10 carriages weren't parked together, but set off in several batches. Brando let his men ride the carriages into the city first. It wasn't his first time in Ampere Seal, but he knew that the young men of the White Lion Legion who came from the countryside of Tanajul couldn't wait to see the largest and most prosperous city in Erewhon. The carriages entered the inner city from the port gate. Because of the constant flow of goods, the roads in this area were wet and emitted a salty smell of the sea. Most of the buildings on both sides of the road were all kinds of trading houses, from fur to logs, from gems to metal minerals, as well as art, gold and silver utensils. Goods from all over the world gathered here. In any place south of Ampere Seal, you wouldn't see so many people gathered in one place. These people came from the north, the south, and even foreign lands. Amandina even saw some merchants, mercenaries, adventurers, and travelers from the Nine Phoenix Empire. They were all dressed differently, and everyone in the carriage was stunned for a moment. After all, this young man only wanted to change class to a Templar knight, and not join the Holy Cathedral. He put away the letter and replied, "Originally, it was Master Tullman's request that the Lord Officiant personally salute you, but you came at a bad time. The Lord Officiant just happened to be out. Why don't you come back after a while?" As soon as the elder priest spoke, Brando saw the Holy Cathedral guard beside him suddenly become strange. Marcia above, there were countless people in Ampere Seal who were willing to pay any price to have the Archbishop perform the ritual for their children, but everyone knew that it was impossible. It was not just a matter of obtaining power, but a special honor. The Archbishop had only performed the ritual for one person in the past 10 years, and that was at the request of King Oberg VII. It was to improve the relationship between the Holy Cathedral and Aween, and that person was now the commander of the White Lion Legion, a territory of his own. Thinking of this, the Holy Cathedral guard could not help but stare at Brando a little dumbfounded, as if he wanted to see what was different about this young man. However, Brando secretly felt that things were not going well. He only came here to change class to a Templar Knight, and not to do anything else. In his opinion, the less trouble there was, the better. Anyway, he did not care about the few free levels. It would be best if he could just find a third-rate archbishop to bow to him. Brando was now a little regretful that he asked Tullman to write the letter of introduction. If he really did get Wood to bow to him, he would probably be on the front page of the Noble Circle in Ampere by tomorrow morning, and soon people would find out who he was. Brando did not believe that there were any secrets in this world that could really be kept. His current advantage was that the enemy was in the open while he was in the dark. If the Holy Cathedral really did this, he would probably be able to escape back to Tonajul tomorrow. Not only him, but also the reputation of the entire Holy Cathedral of Fire, and Tullman himself would be ruined. Brando did not dare to imagine how terrible it would be. Fortunately, thanks to the protection of Lady Martha, Wood was not there. This was the only thing that let Brando breathe a sigh of relief. He hurriedly shook his head and replied, "There's no need. I just yearn for the way of the golden flames. As for who bowed to me, it doesn't matter." Brando's words were full of righteousness, and the elderly priest's eyes lit up when he heard it. He could not help but nod and say, "Not bad, not bad. There are very few young people who think like you nowadays. Those nobles. Say, let's not talk about it. Then let's do it this way, I will personally bow to you." At this point, the old man could not help but look at Amandina and Scarlet and then asked, "But your servants can't go in with you?" The back of his left hand was immediately lacerated, revealing a deep wound. But he still took a step forward and slashed his sword straight towards his ribs. Devard could tell that if the sword landed, the blade would pass through between his 7th and 8th ribs, causing severe damage to his lungs. Devard finally lost his spirit. A silver mirror suddenly appeared in the path of Brando's sword. Dang! Sparks flew everywhere as Brando's sword heavily struck the silver mirror. A circle of ripples appeared on the surface of the silver mirror. It was like mercury, but after the ripples passed, not even a shallow mark was left. Next, a series of flashes formed a sphere with Devard as the center. Upon closer inspection, it was a silver convex mirror. These silver mirrors flashed and disappeared, forming a hemispherical defense around the eagle swordsman. Passive elemental power. Brando had long known that Devard's elemental power was the silver wall. The passive elemental power of this elemental power was somewhat similar to the fire shield. It would automatically defend the elemental power from external physical attacks. Of course, this was not an absolute defense. As long as the attacker's strength exceeded the elemental power's limit, this layer of defense could be easily broken. This passive elemental power could provide a considerable advantage in a battle of the same level. It was almost invincible in a battle of the same level. Devard had finally used this elemental power. In fact, this already showed that he was inferior to Brando in swordsmanship. If this was a contest of swordsmanship, then Devard would have already lost. But unfortunately, this was a duel. Only then did Devard have the time to wipe his sweat. When he touched his forehead, he realized that it was covered in cold sweat. He looked up at Brando, unable to believe that this youth who was much younger than him had such superior swordsmanship. It was clearly military swordsmanship, but it was not. When he was young, he had been taught by the sword Saint Darius. He had seen the legendary sword saint's modified military swordsmanship. But this youth's military swordsmanship was even better. When he used his sword, it was as if he was on the battlefield. To enter the battlefield with the sword, this was the domain of the sword saint. Devard stared at Brando and could not help but ask, "Who are you?" Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 537. It's none of your business. Brando was not in the mood to answer Devard's question. He put down his sword and his aura changed. The strength of a gold pinnacle made everyone's expression change. Princess Magadal and Marquis Yoakum had seen Scarlet's strength before. She was at the pinnacle of gold pinnacle, but now she was an upper gold pinnacle at such a young age. Even the nun princess had doubts in her heart. Who was this young man? No wonder Archbishop Wood had to personally greet him. Marquis Yoakum had to be serious. It was not strange for a noble family to have a gold ranker as a servant, but for a young child to have such strength, he had to be cautious. He quietly made a gesture to Devard, hinting him not to kill. A family that could cultivate a gold ranker at such a young age would not be weak. The eyes of the Marquis flashed, but the cold expression on his face did not change. He was determined to teach Brando an unforgettable lesson. An upper gold ranker against an elemental awakening. In fact, Brando had reached upper gold ranker because he had just obtained a level 15 Templar Knight. However, he did not hesitate. This time he did not use military swordsmanship. Brando first used the charge skill, and his whole body turned into a phantom. This terrifying speed made Devard's scalp tingle. But he immediately recognized that this was the special skill of the Sun Knight. He immediately held his breath and raised both his swords. It's just speed. In front of the silver wall, speed is useless. The eagle swordsman could not help but comfort himself. Brando's sword pointed at Devard's long and short swords. He took a step forward, and the 9 luminary sword art immediately created a phantom behind him. Brando's sword slashed down, and a silver mirror appeared in front of Devard like before. Dang! The long sword and the silver mirror shook violently together. In order to hide his identity, Brando did not use Haurangaya. However, his passive element was stability. Even if he used an ordinary longsword, it was still indestructible. Otherwise, the longsword in his hand would have turned into countless pieces of steel. Brando's attack was within Devard's expectations. A gold-rank swordsman would not be able to penetrate his silver wall. He sneered inwardly and raised his swords to stab at Brando. Unfortunately for Devard, the sword that was blocked by the silver wall did not even have time to retract it. Instead, another sword slashed down from the void. It was as if Brendel's afterimage was in 2 different dimensions at the same time. The eagle swordsman could not believe his eyes. The sword hit the same spot on the silver wall again. Although the silver wall floated outside of Devard's body in a hemispherical shape, the elemental power was still the source of the elemental power. The vibrations caused by Brando's 2 swords were like slashes on Devard's body. Especially the second sword. He was caught off guard and was sent flying by the sudden huge force. Brando was unforgiving. Under the effect of charge, he flashed up and down in the courtyard 8 times. Each time, he left an afterimage of the 9 luminaries' sword art. It was as if 9 Brandos were attacking Devard at the same time, and each afterimage had a completely different attack path. Although Devard was a master swordsman, he had never seen an ancient swordsmanship like the 9 luminaries' sword art. This was a legendary swordsmanship that was as famous as Cruz's flash strike sword art. It was not something his eagle strike sword art could compete with. Not to mention Brando had the upper hand from the beginning. He could not find a way to fight back at all. Devard was dumbfounded. He had more power than Brando, but he could not use it at all. 9 Brandos were surrounding him and attacking him. No matter how powerful an elemental awakener was, it was impossible to deal with 9 gold-ranked upper ranks at the same time. Not to mention, these 9 gold-ranked upper ranks were telepathically connected and worked closely together. There was no flaw to be found. At this moment, even Princess Magadol, who had no understanding of swordsmanship, could see that Brando's attack was too fast. She did not know that it was because of the 9 luminaries' sword art. She only knew that Brando's speed had exceeded the limit. She could not help but be stunned for a moment. How can there be such fast swordsmanship? Marquis Yoakum's eyes flashed. For a moment, he could not help but move his hand away from his wound. His face was covered in blood, but he did not feel it. But Brendel did not manage to break through the silver wall's defense after 9 consecutive strikes. Instead, he saw pieces of silver scales sticking out from the soil in the courtyard, and he immediately knew that something was wrong. He did not expect that the 9 luminaries' sword art would not be able to break through the defense of the silver wall. Instead, it made his opponent angry. Devard's active elemental power, the silver wave, was no joke. Once the great swordsman decided to use his active elemental power, this battle would likely become a bitter one. He had to end this quickly. Brando took a deep breath. The 9 figures merged into one. Although it seemed that he had the upper hand previously, his left hand was bleeding profusely. His right hand that was holding the sword was also cracked. The power of the elemental awakener was not to be underestimated. Just the recoil from Devard's parry was already too much for him to handle. However, he did not hesitate. His body stopped, and the long sword in his hand was already slashing towards Devard's wall of light. The eagle swordsman Devard was forced to this point by a junior who was 2 realms lower than him. At this moment he was extremely angry. Chapter 539. In this world there was no such thing as an impenetrable wall. In just 3 days, the news of the duel at the Anderla Cathedral had spread among the nobles, and then to the commoners. One side of the duel was the famous sword hero Erek, but he lost to a young man of unknown origin. Until the bards adapted this experience into a story, Brando had become the most outstanding person of Erewhon's younger generation. At least in Ampere Seal, his fame was almost on par with Erewhon's younger generation of nobles. Almost everyone was guessing who he was, but only a few people knew that Captain Wood had personally presided over the ceremony for him. This person must have an extraordinary background. For a time all the forces in Ampere Seal, big and small, were moved. Even the future Princess Regent sent people to investigate Brando's background, especially after her close friend, Magadol, found out the truth of the matter. Erek and House Cipher were no exception. The roads of Ampere Seal were suddenly filled with people from all walks of life, causing chaos. Fortunately, the ordinary citizens had long gotten used to the way the nobles would tense up at the slightest sign of trouble. The people who lived in such a tense atmosphere comforted themselves by saying that as long as the port of Ampere Seal was still filled with white sails and the Anderla Cathedral still existed, the port would not decline. The bell of the Holy Temple was a commentary to this phrase, and day after day it continued to ring throughout the gray and white harbor city, unmoved. In the midst of the panic, Brando himself spent every day in Ampere Seal in an orderly manner. As he expected, as long as the Archbishop of the Anderla Cathedral did not say anything, no one would find him. Over the past week, he had met the owner of the auction, Count Donner, under the introduction of Magadol. The latter was very interested in the painting of Princess Anyao that he wanted to sell. However, Brando, or rather the merchant lady, smiled politely and did not show him the painting in his hand. Instead, He tactfully said that he would send the painting over in a few days for Count Donner to verify its authenticity. Brendel found it hilarious to watch the Baron's itchy face and Romaine's slow and unhurried conversation. But in the end, even this experienced businessman could not help but sigh at his inferiority, praising that Romaine was born to be a businesswoman. This was somewhat out of Brando's expectations. He knew that the Roman lady was talented in business, but her brain was not very clear. Or it could be said that her logic circuit was different from ordinary people. Plus, she did not have many opportunities to deal with people in the same field. In other words, she lacked experience. After all, talking on paper was different from actually doing it. This was even more so when dealing with people. To be honest, before he brought her here, he was wondering if this little cutie would have stage fright. How was it, Brando? When they walked out of Baron Donner's mansion, the little Roman raised her head proudly and stared at him. Her slender neck supported her beautiful head. Her dark brown hair was tied up, and she wore the black dress that Brando bought for her at Bragg's. Under the curve of her neck, her collarbone shone like snow. She wore a ruby necklace that shone like fire and blood. The necklace shone brightly, and in a trance, it set off the merchant lady's confidence and pride. Brando could completely understand her pride. Because she was the person he loved, she was proud. This faint smile with her aura made Brando's heart palpitate. Yes. Brando nodded subconsciously. Little Roman, you did better than I expected. I just didn't expect that old gentleman to praise you so much. He is, even in this city, he is considered a person with a reputation. Brando suddenly realized that the little Roman's opponent was not simple. Donner's life was also the story of another genius. That man was the first person in Empire who relied on his identity as a merchant to obtain the honor of being a noble. The old man is too kind. The Roman raised her willowy eyebrows and answered matter-of-factly. Brendel turned back to look at her. It was rare to see the merchant lady being so humble. Even when she was still in Bucci, this young lady's heart was higher than the sky. She would never show her hesitant side in front of anyone, as if she was born to be the master of the scene. If there is desire, there will be a weakness. The little Roman replied in an unfathomable tone, but the second half of the sentence was leaked. Aunt said that if someone uses Brando and the little Roman to make a deal, the Roman will also feel distressed. The first half of the sentence sounded reasonable, but the more Brendel heard, the more ridiculous it became. He pinched the little boy's cheeks and said, "Don't talk about using your fiancé to make a deal with me in such a serious manner. Ouch, 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 Brando, you. Ouch, let go." The merchant lady immediately raised her eyebrows, and her little face was twisted by Brando. Beside them, nun Princess Magadol looked at the man and woman with a strange expression. She did not know why, but she felt a little envious. After a long while, she squeezed out a suitable sentence. "The two of you have such a good relationship." Brando smiled and let go of the little Roman. He raised his head and looked at the bright silver moon above Empire. In the next few days, the news of the war in the north finally spread. The Kurlutz people had already marched their cavalry into the sword fortress, and the threat of the lion beastmen seemed to have become a reality overnight. The holy war quickly replaced the young swordsman as the hottest topic among the people of Empire. Even the air seemed to be brewing with a heavy sense of conspiracy. The Anderla Cathedral was about to change, and the cathedral became busy. On the other hand, ever since he saw Devard the Eagle by Marquis Joachim's side, Brando smelled a hint of hidden danger. He asked Sue and Andrique's subordinates to gather information. Vampires were creatures that lived in the shadows, and spying was one of their best jobs. Madara had sent vampires to infiltrate humans several times to gather information, and Brando was just following suit. However, the news that Mephistopheles and Andrique found out only increased his suspicions. It was said that Erek was now staying in a castle in the south of Empire, and the castle was heavily guarded. Brando knew Erek's temperament very well. He was a cunning old fox, and if he was so cautious, he must be brewing some kind of conspiracy. It was a pity that the female vampire had tested the castle's defenses and could not do anything. This news made Brando feel a sense of urgency. He wanted to see Princess Grafine and warn her in advance, but it was a pity that the princess's manor was also heavily guarded. Otherwise, he would have wanted to sneak in at least once. The time for the meeting of the nobles was getting closer and closer, and in the end Brando had to give up his suspicions about Erek. On the other hand, Archbishop Brando would send his confidants to inform him every day about the movements of the nobles in the Holy Cathedral. Of course, this information seemed to be floating on the surface, and as long as Brando moved his hands, he could find out. However, Archbishop Wood's actions saved him a lot of time, and on the other hand, he could rest assured about the movements of the Holy Cathedral. In comparison, Archbishop Wood was still presiding over the daily affairs of the Holy Cathedral of Fire in the Anderla Cathedral, and this message alone conveyed enough information. After settling down, Brando had to face the problem of how to sneak into the meeting of the nobles. This was the biggest problem he had to solve. He would not ask Archbishop Wood for help after all. This was a matter of great importance and could easily be used against him. Not to mention that the Archbishop would definitely not agree. Brando himself was not willing to cause trouble for the Holy Cathedral of Fire for the time being. He thought about it, and only the news that Sue brought back a week ago was more reliable. Of course, it was actually not reliable news. In the middle of the month of recovery, 2 days before the meeting of the nobles, Ampere Seal faced the sea to the west, and the Shakrod Strait divided the narrow peninsula. The salty sea water carved a white trail under the cliffs, constantly beating the dark brown rocks. Geographically, Ampere Seal was located at the end of the northern branch of the Anseli Mountains, Erek Mountains, where the mountains met the sea. This was where the sea breeze and the sea current converged. The climate was humid, and clouds gathered at the foothills. The result of the abundant rainfall was a forest cover. To the east of the port city, there were large forests, dense with black pine and Erek hazel. The silver fairy princess Metasha was hiding in the bushes, her silver-gray battle robe covered with the wet dew of the night. She could not help but cough twice. Her gaze passed through the forest on the mountainside, and in the darkness not far away, there was a small town that was brightly lit. There were a few manors in the small town, and this place was more than 10 miles away from Ampere Seal. This town could be said to be dependent on the port city. There were many towns like this near Ampere Seal. Is it here, Sue? She used her knuckles to tap the map on the tree stump, and turned back to ask. Sue's eyes sparkled under the light, but there was no expression in them. It was as if answering this question was as boring as reciting a book, but she still completed it meticulously. Her gaze also fell on the foot of the mountain. She had ordered her subordinates to confirm this town many times over the past few days, and there was no mistake. The Silver Fairy Princess was born to not doubt her companions. After hearing this answer, she turned back to the dark forest and whispered, "My lord." A gritting sound came from the bushes. Wait, hiss. F***CKBLZ's Little Tyrant Server. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 540. The girl's soft lips were like a feather, gently imprinting on his neck, making Brando shudder. Her sharp teeth rubbed against his skin, penetrating his skin and piercing into his arteries. Andrique was like a soft and boneless cat lying on top of Brando's body, carefully tasting the taste of his blood and letting out a satisfied nasal sound. After sucking his blood, the princess-like vampire licked his neck as if she hadn't had enough, making Brando shudder in pain. Brando sucked in a breath of cold air. Normally, vampires would release an emotional factor to their host when they were sucking blood, causing the host to fall into an illusory state of happiness. Generally speaking, being sucked blood was a painful and joyful thing. However, Andrique never bothered to do so. According to her, it was something that only shameless people would do. Every time this happened, a certain trap would be shot and fall to the ground. In short, being sucked blood by Andrique was a very painful thing. The only consolation was that every time the girl sucked blood, she would snuggle into Brando's arms like a lover, exuding a seductive charm. Andrique was definitely a femme fatale. Her well-proportioned and boneless body was completely pressed against Brando's chest, and Brando could almost feel 2 soft lumps touching his skin. The girl's curvaceous thighs stretched out from under the ruffles of her black dress, as white as jade under the moonlight in the wilderness. It really made one's imagination run wild. "I'm done," Andrique said to the Mephistopheles as if she was the host. The vampire replied with an "oh." The blood descendants were like a hierarchical society. After the noble girl finished drinking her host's blood, the Mephistopheles kissed Brando's neck from both sides. Hey hey! Brando was held down by the two gold-ranked vampires and couldn't move. You said you wouldn't bite my neck. Even my big sister can bite it, why can't I? There's a difference between men and women. Mephistopheles playfully fluttered her long eyelashes and pretended not to hear him. She tucked her hair behind her ear with one hand and bent down to take a bite. Brando rubbed his neck and looked at Metisha apologetically. The Silver Fairy Princess smiled gently at him. My lord, now that you've found out that you're with us undead, you'll encounter all kinds of trouble, right? Because they are not living creatures, they have to rely on something to entrust themselves to this world. This is the law of the dead. Only then did Brando remember that the little princess was also a ghost. However, she was probably the most beautiful ghost in the world. The Silver Fairy Princess's long silver hair and armor glowed faintly. This was actually a special characteristic of a spirit body. Brando shifted his gaze away from her and looked towards the small town at the foot of the mountain. How is it? The small town at the foot of the mountain was silent in the darkness. There was only a hazy light in the distance. Only the elves could see so far and so clearly. Of course, the merchant lady could as well. It's here. Sue answered. Sue said that it's here. Lord Nightsong had also led the other mercenaries of Lopez to investigate. The townspeople said that there was indeed a foreign noble living here for the past few weeks, but they're not sure if it's Count Yenbao. Metisha replied. Brando listened and nodded. This was the answer that Sue had given him, to replace the Count's envoy and attend the meeting of the nobles. Kidnapping the envoy of the Count, or even the Count himself, sounded ridiculous, but it coincided with Brando's thoughts. The meeting of the nobles would be held in 2 days at the Sephora Manor, which was the property of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The Holy Cathedral of Fire would arrange their own personnel to maintain the venue, so it was impossible for outsiders to sneak in. Of course, Brando would not be stupid enough to ask for Captain Wood's help in this matter, mainly because it would be too easy to leave evidence behind. Besides, with the position of the Archbishop, he would definitely not agree. The only way was to pretend to be a noble. Now it was known that 5 of the 6 Grand Dukes were participating in this meeting. Among them, Grand Duke Vero and Grand Duke Karsuk had sent their own envoys. Grand Duke Cypher and Grand Duke Arek had gone personally. Corvado was the fief of the royal family, so the envoys of the eldest prince would naturally go as well. Only Grand Duke Grinoires maintained his usual indifferent attitude, and did not even have the mood to send an envoy. Of course, as long as Brando's brain was still working, he would not want to pretend to be these people. For the same reason, the 2 marquises and Prince Lu Ku were the same, leaving only the 5 special counts of Erewhon. Count Ranner was naturally impossible. Count Vitokin was also ruled out as the commander of the Black Blade Squad, and Count Janalesu was the commander of the Royal Fleet, so he could not choose either. Therefore, Brando could only pretend to be 2 people left. One was Count Cordo of Grey Mountain, and the other was Count Yenbao. However, Count Grey Mountain's territory was next to Corvado, so he must be familiar with it. In contrast, Yenbao was located at the northern border of the kingdom, and was the weakest special count. Its count rarely dealt with the other nobles of the kingdom. It could be said that he lived in seclusion. Even Brando, a player who usually ran around, had never seen this count, and even fewer people in the noble circle of the kingdom were familiar with him. With such a comparison, the answer was clear. It doesn't matter if it is or not, let's take a look first. Kidnapping a noble's envoy sounded simple, but Count Yenbao was still a special count. How could he not be heavily guarded? However, Brando believed in the strength of his subordinates, so he decided to take a look first. Count Yenbao's manor was located in a secluded forest near the town. This count did not have any reliable friends in Ampere Seal, so the manor was rented temporarily. Ampere Seal often had merchants and nobles from all over the kingdom, so there were many manors like this in the vicinity. Before coming here, Sue had already sent people to inquire about this manor. This manor was the property of a merchant who did not have any background. This news also made Brando feel more at ease about the whole plan. The group quietly snuck into the Erek Hazel forest less than 100 meters away from the manor. The bushes here were dense, and at this distance, they did not have to worry about being discovered by the manor's guards. However, even so, Brando still ordered Medisha to stay further away. The fairy princess's slightly glowing silver armor was really suitable for stealth operations. He simply let her and Scarlet lead the Fireclaw lizardmen to set up a suitable distance. If there were any accidents, at least they could provide support. No matter what, their next move could be said to be a little crazy, and Brando had to be careful. Beside Brando were the mercenaries of Lopez, the two cute Miss Vampires, and Andrique's black derivatives, the Blood Descendants. These Blood Descendants were all young boys and girls, and their strength was between the peak of iron and the beginning of silver. However, they were exceptionally good at stealth operations, and were not inferior to the experienced mercenaries from the 10 cities. In addition, there was also an extremely untimely presence. Miss Merchant had quietly followed Brando without anyone's permission. When she walked, she was like a little kitten. If she had not been sneakily following behind Brando, even Brando himself would not have noticed this little fellow. It had to be said that this was an incredible stealth talent, especially when she had not been specially trained. Even the best fighter in the mercenaries of Lopez, Nightingale, could not help but praise her. However, from Brando's point of view, it was more like this young lady was born with these skills that could be used to do bad things. In short, the word virtuous did not apply to Miss Merchant. However, Brando had also thought it through. Instead of letting this little thing play tricks in places where he could not notice, it was better to keep her by his side. At least he could monitor her and prevent her from causing any trouble. Therefore, after strictly ordering the Roman to stay within 5 feet of him, he decided to let this young lady do as she pleased. It seemed that the little Roman was quite satisfied with Brando's order. In fact, she just wanted to go on an adventure with him. After settling this little interlude, Brando released a few wind spirit spiders. The wind spirit spiders could not share his senses, so their use in scouting the terrain was minimal. However, they were extremely useful in monitoring the surroundings. Then he raised his head and looked in the direction of the manor and asked, "How many guards are there? I can clearly see one at the main entrance, but I don't know if there are any hidden sentries, my lord." In the dark, a vampire's vision was much better than a human's, so one of the vampires immediately answered. Brando was quite satisfied with this answer. Behind the layers of trees, it was difficult to clearly see the manor from 100 meters away. He nodded and used the wind spirit spiders to sense if there were any hidden sentries. He was about to order everyone to approach the manor when the Roman suddenly said. The Roman saw that there were still people in the manor. "I saw someone by the fountain in the courtyard. Oh, he seemed to have kicked something." He bent down to pick up the stone and threw it into the fountain. Everyone looked at the merchant lady in shock. Brando then remembered that there was a human-shaped self-driving radar beside him. He suddenly felt that it was a great idea for the merchant lady to follow him. He quickly asked, "Did you see any hidden sentries?" "Hidden sentries? He's the one who hid." "Oh, there are 2 of them. Where are they?" The Nightsong Tiger raised his eyebrows and immediately asked. "They're behind the guard at the entrance." The Nightsong Tiger immediately turned to Brando and said, "They're very experienced, and we don't know how many people are in the courtyard. This is going to be troublesome, my lord." As an experienced mercenary, the captain of the mercenaries of Lopez was very sensitive to the location of the sentries. He could often make a rough guess based on the clues. Brando had always trusted his judgment, so he nodded and muttered, "Do you have any ideas? Find a way to catch a tongue." The Nightsong Tiger replied. Brando nodded again. "Then Mephistopheles, follow me." With that, a layer of dense black smoke suddenly appeared on his clothes. This layer of black smoke quickly enveloped the conspicuous red blessings and Howran Gaia. Brando did not want to expose his identity, so the best choice was to disguise himself as a member of the Dark Church. He pulled up the hood of his cloak and was about to leave, but at this moment, the Roman suddenly took out a small and exquisite silver cage and said with a proud expression, "Brando, do you want to catch someone? Roman will help you." Before Brando could react, the Roman clapped her hands and chanted, the person in the cage who took away your freedom." She clapped her hands and a white light flashed in the cage, and a small person appeared in the empty silver cage. Brando and the others were not surprised. Andrique, Mephistopheles, and the other vampires looked at the merchant lady in shock. "What is this?